Ping. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, especially during this very difficult pandemic days. I'm very excited to have you all to join us. And even though this is a webinar, I hope it can be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to share them with us in the chat box. But I'm not very good at multitasking, so I will answer your questions at the end of the session, okay? So let's get started. The title of my presentation is Supporting Students' Engagement in Academic Literacy in Content Areas. And I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorite teaching approaches, that is content-based instruction. So today, first of all, we're going to go through what content-based instruction is. Then we will talk about why shall we adopt this approach? What are the benefits of using this approach? And then I will go through how can we plan an effective content area reading lesson with content-based instruction. And I will share with you a lot of hands-on activities that you can implement before, during, and after reading. So let's start with the first one, what content-based instruction is. Content-based instruction is a teaching approach that our teacher uses the target language, such as English, as the medium to teach both the language and content at the same time. So when I say language here, I doesn't mean conversational English that our students use every day. Here I mean academic English. Academic English is the English that we use at school. And also we can say academic English in textbooks, assignments, and even assessments. So if you want to help our students to be successful in college or in their workplace, we need to help them to improve their academic English, right? As for the content here, I mean like different kinds of subject areas, such as math, science, social studies, and English language arts. So when I was teaching in the US, I use content-based instruction a lot. So when I'm working with my students, I always want to achieve two goals. First of all, I want them to be able to develop their English proficiency. Secondly, I hope I can help them to be successful in their content areas. That is, they can do really well in all kinds of subjects, such as science, math, and social studies. So when we use content-based instruction, basically we're trying to help students to improve not only their language, but also their content knowledge. Then you might be surprised that actually content-based instruction is commonly used in not only the ESO context, but also the EFL context. ESO context, in those contexts, English is their official language. So like the UK and the US. However, in EFL context, English is not their official language. So English is more like a foreign language. So like in Brazil, China, countries in Europe, and also Taiwan. So you might be wondering why content-based instruction is commonly used in both ESO context and EFL context. The main reason is that these schools are trying to prepare students to pass the exams that are aligned with the Common Core state standards. Or these schools try to help students to become bilingual and biliterate. And also, content-based instruction is not only used in middle school, it is also commonly used from kindergarten to college. Then why shall we adopt this approach? Actually, there are a lot of benefits of using this approach. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, content-based instruction is trying to help students to improve both their content knowledge and also English, right? So when we use this approach, we can help students to improve their subject matter knowledge. And also, we are also achieving a better English learning outcomes. And if teachers use this approach, basically they are teaching students English with authentic materials. When we use authentic materials and also we have students practice their English in authentic context, we know that students can learn the English the best, right? And even students will become more interested and even more motivated. And also, like I mentioned earlier, content-based instruction puts great emphasis on the academic English. So that is, students will get a lot of opportunities to practice both their oral and written academic English. So if we use this approach, we can help them to improve their academic English a lot. So I have finished talking about what content-based instruction is and what are the benefits of using this approach. Here comes to the highlight of today's presentation. So how do we plan an effective content area reading lesson with this approach? And at the meantime, I'm going to share with you what are some activities you can implement before, during, and after reading. So to help you better understand how to implement this activity, I'm going to use the reading lesson from Reach Higher to set as an example to help you better understand the ideas. To plan an effective lesson with content-based instruction, it is important that we need to follow certain guidelines. And I think this guideline is one of the most important ones. That is, we need to design the lesson based on appropriate learning sequences. So the learning sequences, first of all, will include that teachers need to assess and build on students' prior knowledge. And then teacher will explain the purpose of activities. After that, we will help students to develop learning strategies, and also we will provide students with a lot of opportunity to practice their language and also the content. So since I'm going to demonstrate a reading lesson to you, so I'm going to divide my lesson into 3 parts. First of all is the before reading. So for my before reading parts, I'm going to include these 2 elements in my reading lesson. And then I will move on to the during reading stage. For the during reading stage, I'm going to include this element. So I will show you how to help students to develop learning strategies. And then comes to my after reading stage. For this stage, I'm going to share with you what can we do to offer enough opportunities for students to process the information. So before I jump into before reading stage, I would like to invite you to think about this question. Do you see 2 students, student A and student B? And I would like to invite you to think about which students may achieve a better understanding of books. So for student A, his teachers provides him with linguistically simple books. That is, the English words are easy, the grammar and the sentence structures are also relatively easy. However, the students are not familiar with the content. As for student B, her teacher provides her with linguistically difficult books. That is, the vocabulary, words, the grammar, and the sentence structures are pretty hard. However, the student is familiar with this content. So please think about which student may achieve a better understanding of the books. So Emily, could you please help us with the poll? So for the attendees, could you please choose the one that think that can achieve a better understanding? Thank you.
I'm just having a little bit of a technical difficulty with the poll. If we could just use the chat box for this one, that'd be great.
Sure. So I see a lot of you saying B with a question mark. Okay. All right. So let's do this. Wait for 10 more seconds. Okay. So one attendee said, yeah, A. Okay. So 5 more seconds. All right. So thank you so much for participating. And so the answer is student B. Yes, some of you already mentioned that's because of the context. Yes, actually this question comes from a study. This study tries to tell us that before reading activities are central to how successfully our students will be able to read the text. So that's why today I will put great emphasis on before reading activities. And later you will see how I do this. So before reading stage, the purpose of this stage is that we need to help our students to get a general understanding of the text. So let me use this picture to help you better understand this idea. So imagine this is our student. And this is the learning outcome you want your students to be able to achieve. However, you can see that this learning outcome may be new to the student, or this learning outcome is so far to reach for the students. So as we are educators, what can we do? We need to provide sufficient scaffolding. So the learning activities here are the scaffolds. So students will be able to achieve the learning outcomes that we want them to achieve. So for before reading, there are a lot of things we can do, such as we can activate students' prior knowledge, or we can prepare students for potential linguistic or conceptual difficulties that they may encounter when they are reading a text. Or we can introduce content and language objectives. If you include these three kinds of activities in your reading lesson, basically you cover the first two elements that I mentioned to you for the principle to design an effective reading lesson. Okay, so we know that, remember the poll or the question that I asked you, that we know that the student B can achieve a better understanding because she has some prior knowledge. So we can know that activating students' prior knowledge is really important. But how? So how can we help students activate their prior knowledge? Can you please share your thoughts with me in the chat box? I'm very excited and interested in knowing your answer. So we will have about 1 minute to do that. Okay, some of you say we can use pictures, brainstorming, ask questions, or even play a video, ice break. Okay, little survey, guessing games, yeah. KWL charts or some games. Oh, or sing a song, all right. Review some vocab, okay, sure. Okay, so 20 more seconds. Okay, good. So a lot of you mentioning about introducing vocabularies or using photos and pictures. Okay, or using games. All right, so that's wrap up for this question. Okay, or give them the topic they are familiar with and to do some brainstorming. Okay, go to nature, right? So thank you so much for your contribution. It's such a pleasure to read your thoughts. All right, so for me, I like to ask students a big question. So remember that I mentioned I'm going to use this reading from Rich Hire as an example to show you how to design the reading lesson. So like in the beginning, I will ask students a big question. So did you see this in the lower left corner? So the big question is, where do we get water? So after I ask a big question, I will also combine this big question with this activity. This activity is called a concept map. So I will either put the big question in the middle of the board, or I will just put some keywords on either on a board or on a piece of a paper. So this is my big question. And then I will start to invite my students to brainstorm. So this is a great activity because first of all, we can assess students' understanding, and then we can build on their understandings because sometimes they may know some concepts in their first language, but they don't necessarily know how to say that in their L2, that is English. So we can demonstrate how to say those key academic terms in English. And after students finish brainstorming, and then I will invite them to take a look at the concept map. We will group the similar ideas together. And I will also keep the concept map throughout the entire reading because when we are doing the reading, students may have new concepts and they can add their ideas to this concept map. So this concept map will become a visual summary for the students. And you may wonder, okay, what if my students don't have any background knowledge or prior knowledge about this topic? Then what can we do? That is totally okay. Then you can try this activity. This activity is called sequencing illustrations. So you can screenshot the pictures from the textbooks and put them in random order. And then you can put students in pairs. They can start to discuss, and then they will think about what would be the possible sequence for the story or for the text. And then you can have the whole class share. So after some discussion, basically students can guess what would be the possible sequence for the entire text. So for this activity, it is not necessary for English language arts. It can also be used for science or social studies when you try to teach a historical event. So I finished discussing how can we activate students' prior knowledge. We can either use a concept map with a big question, or we can use sequencing illustrations. Now I would like to move on to the second point. So how can we prepare students for potential linguistic or conceptual difficulties? So what can we do? So can you please share your thoughts with me in the chat box? And we will have about 1 or 2 minutes to do this. I'm very excited to know about your answers. So allow me to repeat the question. My question is, what can we do to prepare learners for potential linguistic or conceptual difficulties that they may encounter when they are reading? Reading activities, vocabulary activities. Okay, showing an image. Act it out, role play, good. Vocab, okay, give them some examples. Explain strategies, yes, I like it. You can use flashcards and poster, absolutely. Okay, we have 30 more seconds to finish this activity. Allowing them to infer, but probably we need to show them how, right? Okay. Oh, make different story ending. Yeah, probably this we can use maybe after reading, right? All right, keep a short story. Sure. So thank you so much for your contribution. I really enjoyed. I'm really happy to be able to read your answers. Yes. So for me, because we all know that our students may encounter some linguistic or conceptual difficulties when they are reading a text, right? So for me, I like to do these 3 activities. First of all, I will pre-teach vocabulary. Secondly, I will teach some text structures. And lastly, I will introduce reading strategies. So let's start with the pre-teach vocabulary. A lot of you also mentioned this. There are a lot of ways to pre-teach vocabulary, but personally, I'm such a huge fan of vocabulary routines. Like almost for all my classes, I use vocabulary routines. So for vocab routines, has 4 steps. First, students and teacher will pronounce the word together. Second, the teacher will ask students to rate their understanding of the word. Third, then the teacher will give a definition. Last, the teacher will elaborate on the meaning. So let me give you an example to show you how to do this. So for example, if I'm going to teach the word absorb, then I'm going to point to the picture and then I'll pronounce the word with the students and I will say absorb. And then I will have students to rate their understanding of the words with some hand gestures. They will give me a thumbs up if they think they know the word really well. They will give me a thumbs middle if they think they don't know the word. They may know this word, but they're not sure about it. They may give me a thumbs down if they think they know so little about the word. So I love this activity, and also my students love this activity because we can quickly assess our students' understanding. If our students give us, a lot of students give us a thumbs up, then we know we don't need to spend a lot of time on explaining this word, right? But what if a lot of students give us a thumbs down? Then we know we do need to spend enough time on explaining and elaborating on the meaning of the word, right? So after students rate their understanding, then I will provide students with a student-friendly definition. So like for this word, I say it means to take in something in a natural or a gradual way. And then we will start to elaborate on the meaning of the word. So for example, I will ask some questions to help students to be able to relate the word to his or her personal experiences or to the world. So like this question I ask, what are some other things that can absorb water? So students might answer sponge, newspaper. So after this vocabulary routine, we will start to practice making sentences with these keywords. Or you can try this activity. This activity is called word wheels. So for this activity, I don't use it for all the keywords. I only select certain keywords that I want to emphasize. So like for this word, survive. So for the definition, I will either help students with the definition or have students to look up the definition by themselves. And for synonym and antonym, it's the same. I will either help them with that or have them look it up by themselves. But students will do some illustration by themselves to explain the word. And they will make a sentence that with this word. So by doing so, we're helping students to practice using this word. Now, move on teaching text structures. I really like this passage in Cloud's book, so I include this passage in my presentation, and I'm going to read it for you, and please read along with me. Reading comprehension of students across the spectrum increases with the effective use of text structures. When students are aware of a text structure, they can use that knowledge to help them construct meaning. And as a result, their reading comprehension improves. So basically, she tries to say that if we can help students effectively use the text structures, then we can improve their reading comprehension. But how? How can we do that? So can you please share your thoughts with me by typing your answer in the chat box? So my question is, how can we help students to understand text structures? Can you think of any activities to do so? So we will have about 1 minute to do this activity using real text, okay? Paraphrase them, body language translation, vocabulary drill. Introduce a gerund and its elements, sure. Give a similar example or short stories, sure. But we need to think about what kind of activities can help them better understand the text structure. Good, we still have about 20 seconds to do this activity using WH questions. Comparing text, yeah, great, all right. So let's wrap up this activity. All right, sequencing possible? All right. So thank you so much for your contribution again. Thank you. So like for me, I think one of the ways to teach text structure is that we can select a graphic organizer. But the key is that we need to make sure that this graphic organizer has to mirror or match the text structure. So for example, if you're teaching a social study, and then you're teaching a historical event, so probably you can select a sequence chain so you can help students to organize the information, right? And for me, because I'm going to demonstrate you the ring lesson, and for the text, it has a lot of problems and solutions. So I chose a problem solution chart. And later I'm going to show you how, and so don't worry about this now. Now let's move on introducing a reading strategy. So most of us are teachers. So we are fluent readers. When we are reading, we might use a lot of reading strategy unconsciously. However, this is very challenging for our students. So as teachers, we need to make the thinking process visible for them. But how? So let me show you. Usually when I introduce a reading strategy, I will break it down into 4 steps. First of all, I will explicitly explain what the reading strategy is and when they can use it. Then I will show them how to apply this reading strategy with small steps. After that, I will provide them with sentence frames so they will be able to use the sentence frames to describe how they use the reading strategy. And last, I'm going to model how to use this sentence frame to talk about the reading strategy. So let me give you an example. Remember, this is a reading that I'm going to demonstrate with you. So there are a lot of reading strategies. If I remember correctly, there are 7, but here I chose this one, asking questions. So I will tell my students, good readers, they use this reading strategy, asking questions, before, during, and after reading. By doing so, readers can actively interact with the text and get a better understanding. And also, I will tell students they can ask questions when they are curious about something, they want to make a prediction, clarify something, or think more deeply about something. Then that will be a good time for them to ask questions. So after knowing when students can, after students know when they can ask questions, then we can move on to the second step. I'm going to show them how to do so. So remember that my reading strategy is asking questions. So first, I will tell them they need to ask a question. Then they will look for the answers. Sometimes they will be able to find the answers in the textbooks, but sometimes they don't. So if they cannot find the answers in the text, then they will need to make an inference based on their personal knowledge or based on the information from the text. Then they need to think about the question and read on and ask more questions. So after knowing how to using this reading strategy, then I'm going to provide students with sentence frames to help them to describe the process of their thinking. So the first step is asking a question, right? So I'll tell them they can use the English sentence frames like, I wonder, how come, why, what is. And then as for the second step is to look for the answer. So students can try like this sentence frame to describe this process. I read blank, so blank. And then the last step is that students will need to think about the question and read on and ask more questions. So I will provide this sentence frame. They can say, now I wonder. So after knowing that, it's time for me to do some modeling. Remember, we need to make our thinking process visible for our students. So when I do modeling, I always think aloud. So for the reading strategy, asking question, the first step is to ask a question, right? So first I'll point to the picture and then I will ask, I wonder what the story is about. Then move on to the second step. I need to look for answers, right? So I start to read the title. And then I say, I read the title. The title is Frog Brings Rain, though I think the reading is about a frog that can bring rain. Then I'm going to demonstrate the last step. That is, think about a question, read on, and think more questions. So I will demonstrate by saying, now I wonder how the frog can bring rain. So we finished discussing how to prepare students for potential linguistic or conceptual difficulties. We can either pre-teach vocabulary with vocabulary routines or word wheels. Or we can teach them text structures with graphic organizers. Or we can introduce them reading strategies with the 4 steps that I introduced you. Now we can move on to the last activity that we can do for before reading stage. And personally, I think this is the most important one. So remember that for content-based instruction, we're helping our students to improve both their content knowledge and also their English, right? So when we design the lesson, we need to think about both the content objective and language objective. But how can we design content and language objectives? Then you will need to go back to the standards that your government asks you to follow. So for me, because I'm helping my students to prepare for exams that are aligned with the Common Core State standards, so I go to the Common Core State standards. For the subject, English Language Arts, like students need to be able to describe how characters in the story respond to major events and challenges. So I design my content objective based on the Common Core State standard. So my objective is students will be able to identify how characters in the story respond to major events and challenges. So basically, my students need to be able to identify who the characters are, what are the major events, and what is the problem, and how does the character or how do the characters solve the problem. And then here comes to the language objective. Please remember, language objective needs to be aligned with content objective. That is, these two objectives need to be closely related. So my language objective is that students will be able to describe story elements using sentence frames. So you will see the sentence in green. Here are the sentence frames. So the first one is the characters are. So this sentence frame is help students to describe who the characters are. And the sentence frame including in the beginning, in the middle, at the end. So these sentence frames are used to help students to be able to identify the major events and be able to describe them. As for the last two sentence frame, a problem in the story is the character solve the problem by. So this sentence frame are helping students to be able to describe the problems and the solution, right? So we finished discussing the activities we can do for before reading. Now let's move on to during reading. So for before reading stage, after we scaffold a lot and we help students to get a general idea of the reading and also they learn some skills, we move on to the during reading stage. And during this stage, the most important thing is that we need to show students what the fluent reader does to help them to understand the text. And meanwhile, they need to start to practice the skills they have learned during the before reading stage so they can understand the text better. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, during this stage, we need to guide students to apply the skills that they have learned before reading. Remember about this, we introduced the content and language objective to the students and they got a little bit chance to practice before. So now here comes to reading the text. Remember that earlier I mentioned that we can provide we can provide a graphic organizer to help students better understand the text, right? So here I prepare a problem solution chart. The reason why I chose this one is that because these charts can match the text, and also this chart is related to the objectives that I designed for my students. Remember, my content objective is that students will be able to identify how characters respond to major events and challenges. So for my problem and solution chart, do you see? I put down the keywords, the characters, problems, events, and solution. So when students are doing the reading, they need to find the answer to these, and then they will put the keyword into the chart. However, even though they are able to identify the characters, major events, problem, and solution, that is not enough. They need to be able to use English to describe this, right? So meanwhile, I'll ask them to use the sentence frames when they identify the characters. So we already went through the sentence frame during the before reading stage. So at this time, students will practice using these sentence frame. So for example, when they identify characters, then they will use a sentence frame. The characters are first woman, first man, the frog, and some other animals. And then when they identify the problem in the text, I will encourage them to use a sentence frame by saying, a problem in the story is that there was a devastating fire. And as for events and solution, same, they are going to use a sentence frame to describe the story elements they found in the text. So now let's move on to the reading strategies. So remember that before reading, I introduced them a reading strategy that is asking questions. So now when we are doing the reading, we need to start to try to use this reading strategy. When I do this, I always follow these three steps. First of all, I will do modeling. And secondly, I will have them to do guided practice. And finally, they will do some independent practice. So let me show you how. So for modeling, remember that for the first step of the reading strategy, asking a question is that we need to ask a question. So then I will ask by saying, I wonder who would carry water to fire? And then I will demonstrate to the second step. That is, I need to look for the information. So I will have students to read with me. And then I will say, I read their river needed water, so no one was willing to help. Then I will demonstrate how to do the third step. That is, think about a question and read on and think about a new question. Now I wonder how the character will solve the problem. So it depends on your students. Sometimes you only need to do modeling for once or twice, then you can move on to do the guided practice. But sometimes you need to do more. So it depends on your students. And then when students are ready, then you can move on to the guided practice. For guided practice, it means that the whole class and the teacher will work together. So we will work together to practice applying this reading strategy. So let's start with the first step. They need to ask a question, right? But this time we cannot tell students the answer directly. Instead, we're going to prompt them. So for me, if I want the students to be able to ask questions, so I will say, I'll give them some prompts like, what are you curious about? Do you want to make any predictions? And if you do, what are the predictions you'd like to make? And I will also ask, is there anything you'd like to clarify? So by asking questions, students will be able to come up with some questions. Then if students have any thoughts, I will have them raise their hands, and then the volunteer will need to use a sentence frame such as I wonder to talk about his or her question. And then as a whole class, we will read the text together and we will try to find the answer to the question. So if students think they find the answer, and then I'll have them raise their hands again, and then they will share the answer. But I will remind them they need to use a sentence frame to say that. But if the students are really strong, they don't need to use a sentence frame, that is totally okay. And at last, we need to think about a question and then read on and think about more questions. So same, we will work as a whole class. And then I have for students to volunteer if they have any thoughts. So after several practice, I think students are ready to do the independent practice. Then I will have them to start to read silently by themselves. And at the same time, I will ask them to practice the reading strategy, asking a question, and they need to follow the 3 steps. And at the end, I will have some volunteers share with us like how does she or he use this reading strategy, and then he or she needs to use sentence frame to talk about the thinking process. All right, so maybe some of you would like to try to use reading strategy in your class, and you would like to do some modeling with your students. However, maybe you are not sure what kind of questions you can do the modeling. So here I provide you with some ideas that you can ask your students for different stages. Okay, so we finished the during reading stage. Now we can move on to the after reading stage. So for after reading, the most important thing for us to do is that we can use the text that we guide our students to read as a basis to further advance their language development. So let me show you how. There are 2 things we can do. First of all, we can help our students to focus on the information, focus our students' attention more deeply on the information in the text, such as the graphic outlines. And later I will show you how, so don't worry about it now. Or we can use another activity such as sentence reconstruction to help students to develop their understanding of the language. So later I will show you how. So let's start with the first one, graphic outlines. So here I listed the four graphic outlines that are the most commonly used. And you can pick the outline that works for you because it depends on the text that you want to teach with your students. So for me, I chose the timeline because for the reading that I show you, it has a lot of events. So I will show students like this is a good time to use graphic outlines because we can help students to pay attention to signal words. If students can pay attention to the signal words in a passage, basically they can get a better understanding of how the ideas developed and what is the relationship between the ideas. So it is very important for us to help our students to pay attention to signal words when we are working with them with graphic outlines. So I will direct student attention to these signal words and help them to identify the major events. And the students are going to put the major events in the graphic outline. However, if you want to if your text has some compare and contrast, then make sure you show them the signal words and they can put down the information or organize the information. So the graphic outlines are great because they can represent the information in the text. And to do so, students will be able to have a chance to go back to the reading and to reread. And this time they need to reread more carefully in order to complete the text. But what if you don't have enough time? Yeah, sometimes I don't have enough time to do this activity, then that's totally okay. So I will use the problem solution chart that I already worked with my students before when we were reading the text. So I will have my students close their books and they can only rely on the information on the problem and solution chart. So at this time, I will ask my students to retell the story. And I will also use this rubric. You can find this rubric in teachers' books in Reach Higher. So will be a really, really good time for you to assess your students' understanding and also their mastery of the content and language objectives. And so like, for example, if students want to get a high score on the content objective, basically they need to be able to cover all the important elements. And for their language, whether they are able to use a sentence frame to talk about, retell the story or not, or only they are not able to retell a story very completely. So you can kind of use a rubric and to tell students how well they did. So by doing so, students know, okay, how can they improve next time? Because they will get the rubric and they know for like advanced high students, what kind of goals that you want them to be able to achieve. Okay, so now let's move on to sentence reconstruction. I think this activity works really well with beginners, English language learners, and also intermediate English language learners. So what I do is that I will cut up sentences of the text and into words. So students need to reassemble the sentence. So every time they add a new word, they need to read the sentence. So by doing so, students get a chance to take a look at the relationship of the words and the word order in a more complex sentence. So they will be able to read it and read it again and pay close attention to it. By doing so, we can help students to know if you want to write a more complex sentence, what kind of word order you need to pay attention to. And so this is also going to be really helpful for their writing. Okay, so here comes to the end of my presentation. So today we talk about what content-based instruction is. So remember that the teacher will use the target language, such as English, as a medium to teach both language and content at the same time. And there are a lot of benefits of using this approach because we can help students to improve both their content knowledge and also their language. And also students will even become more motivated because you will use authentic context. And usually when you teach a subject that is more related to their life, so some of students will become more interested. And we also talk about how can we do to plan an effective content area reading lesson with content-based instruction. Basically, you will need to follow some guidelines like this one. It suggests that we need to design our lesson based on appropriate learning sequences. And also I share with you what some activities you can do with your students before, during, and after readings. So remember about this one. Before reading, for this stage, the purpose is that we are going to provide students with a lot of scaffolding. So if we provide students with a lot of scaffolding, then it's much more easier for them to get a general understanding of the text. So when they are reading the text, it will be much more, it will be much easier for them to understand it, right? So for before reading, remember that we talked about we can activate students' prior knowledge. And how to do that? First of all, we can use a concept map. Remember the map, and you can have students to brainstorm. Or we can do the sequencing illustrations. Like we can, if students are not familiar with the concept, don't forget, you can screenshot the pictures of the text and put them in random order and have students to organize the order. So they will get a general idea of the text. And as for, or we can also pre-teach the vocabulary with vocab routines. Remember the 4 steps. We will pronounce the word, rate the word, define the word, and also elaborate on the meaning. And also we talk about the word builds, like if you have some keywords you want students to get some extra practice, and you can do that. And also you can also try to teach students the text structures with graphic organizer. But the key is that you need to make sure the graphic organizer can match the text. If it can, please don't select that. And then we also talk about we can introduce a reading strategy to our students with the 4 steps. The first one is that you need to explicitly explain about this reading strategy. Like you will tell them when to use it, and then move on to the small steps, how to use it. And then you will provide them with sentence frame, so they will be able to use a sentence frame to talk about the reading, how they use the reading strategy. And then you will model how to use the sentence frame to describe the reading strategy. And then here it comes to the last activity for before reading. Remember that you need to tell students the content and language objectives. So by doing so, students know the purpose of the activities, and then they can know what do you expect them to do. And don't forget that content and language objectives needs to be closely related. And as for during reading, during this stage, because the purpose is that we need students to be able to understand the text, right? So they need to apply the skills they learn like during the before reading stage. So when we do that, we will try to always do like modeling, guided practice, and independent practice. So like to help them to achieve the learning outcome. So remember, I choose the graphic outlines for them. They need to fill out the information when they're reading, and they also need to use a sentence frame to talk about the text. And then also for the reading strategies, like I mentioned earlier, we follow these 3 steps. So students will be able to reinforce their skill of using the stress over and over again. But make sure you will do modeling, guided practice, independent practice. So with this flow, it will be much more easier for students to achieve the goal you want them to achieve. And here it comes to the after reading. So during this time, we want to use the text they already read as a basis to further advance their language development. So how? Because we want them to think more deeply, right? So we will give them some text. So for example, we can give them some graphic outlines. They need to go back to the reading and read it again, and then they will be able to try to find the information in order to complete the text. And there are 4 kinds of graphic outlines that I share with you. And you can use the one that works the best for you because it depends on which content area you are working. And here comes the last one, language study. So you remember that I cut up the sentences from the text into individual words and have students to reassemble them. So by that time, they will be able to closely study the word order in a more complex sentence. So when they are doing their writing, it will be much more easily for them to write the more complex sentence. And I hope you find today's session informative and helpful, and probably you would like to try some of my ideas in your, you may try some of the ideas from my session in your own reading lesson. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me now. I will be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ping. We have a few minutes, so I think if you want to pick a few questions in the chat box, or excuse me, in the Q&A box to answer, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I'm reading the questions in the chat box. So, oh, sorry, this is my timer to remind me that I only have certain amount of time to talk. Sorry.
You didn't need it. You were perfectly on time.
Yeah. All right. So let me read the question.
Yeah, while you read it, I'm just going to let everyone know I see some questions about the certificate. We will be sending this along with the recording and a PDF of the slides within 5 business days of the webinar. And we do also post the recording and the PDF on our webinar website if you do want to look at those after.
Okay. Okay, I really, so sorry, there are so many questions, so I will try my best. Okay, so I finished reading the first question. Okay, this question is about the use of L1. Okay, actually, I think there is a debate about using L1. So when I was studying at Columbia University, our professor suggested that it depends on your student's level. For beginner Ls, like absolutely, they will need the support from L1. And so you like, but they cannot own, so like for us, for like, remember the text structures that we mentioned earlier, like they will have some signal words like first, next, after, or finally. So when we talk about the text structure, we will also put the Chinese, because some of my students are Chinese, we'll put it both as Chinese or Spanish. So then we'll put it in front of the class, so it will be easy for them. So we can rely some part of the L1, but not heavily. So, and once the student get enough scaffolds, and then probably one day they don't need L1 support, and then you should absolutely avoid using L1. But also it depends, like depend on the context, like because in the US basic students are in the ESL context, when even they leave the classroom, they can still have a lot of chances to practice English, right? But in EFL context it is totally different, because once they come out of the classroom, they don't have any chances to practice their English anymore. So like for EFL context, I think we can only use like the minimum help of L1, but not so much on it. Yeah. I hope this answers your question. Okay, allow me to read the next question. Yeah, okay. All right. So like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of activities you can use to teach vocabulary. So word wheel is just one of them. So I don't think you need to use word wheels like for every class, because it is a little bit time consuming to use this activity. So like I mentioned earlier, I only select some vocabularies I want to emphasize. But I think you can try to use vocabulary routines for all the classes, because I think it can help students to lay a very strong foundation of their acquisition of vocabulary. Okay.
Can do maybe one more and then we'll wrap it up, Ping, if that sounds good.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I have another question to ask about. Okay, some of you asked me like how long it takes. So I think it depends on like usually it depends on whether my students are familiar with the flow or not. So if my students are pretty familiar with the flow, that we will do a lot of before reading activities, that they already have some experiences, like we use the same strategies before. So basically sometimes can be really, really quick. So we can finish the whole lesson with the before reading, during reading, after reading, like in 2 sessions. But it depends on the class, okay? And also about the last question, like you say, can you say the way you use the the higher order thinking question and lower order thinking questions. So like for all my classes, I would try to ask more like higher order thinking question and less lower thinking questions. And so like I say, when remember the reading strategy, when a student asks a question, I will kind of remember my prompts. My prompts is like what kind of prediction you would like to make, or like what are you curious about, or what would you like to clarify. So these are more like the higher order thinking questions. So Emily, we are out of time, right? Okay.
Yep, I think we're out of time. It's been a really wonderful session. A huge thank you to Hsu-Ping for doing 2 of these sessions. This is her second one. Actually, she did one last night per time. So big virtual round of applause for you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being such an engaged audience. It's we're so glad to have you all here. Thank you for spending an hour with us. I do just have a few things to point out as we wrap up here. If you have not participated in Learning Moments already, it is still going on. It's a showcase that we're running through the end of November, where we're asking teachers to share the ways that they've been engaging and motivating their learners in the online classroom. So be sure to visit the Learning Moments site below. We have the QR code and submit your learning moments. We'd love to hear what you've been doing and to share that with other teachers around the world. So be sure to let us know. Just a few other notes as we wrap up here. Many of the examples that Ping used today were from her own experience, but were also from Reach Higher by National Geographic Learning. I'm just going to put the link in the chat box right now. But that is for primary students if you're interested in learning more, and it does use many of the approaches that Ping went over today with content-based English instruction. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending along the certificate following the session, along with a PDF and the recording of the session, and that should come to you in about 5 business days. We will send it to your email address that you joined the session on, so no need to get in touch with us before then. If you don't receive it within 5 business days, you can always feel free to contact us at ngl.webinars@cengage.com. I'm just going to put that into the chat box now. And last but not least, we'd love for you to join us again. We do have an exciting session next week with a National Geographic photographer who will be speaking about a really interesting project that he's been working on through the pandemic and the ways that he's seen community and building that and resilience all through this and adaptation. So there's a lot of lessons to be applied in the classroom from that session. So we hope you can join us next week. And just thanks again, everyone, for being here. I'm going to direct you to a feedback survey now. We'd love to hear what you thought of the session. And we hope to see you again soon. And again, just a huge thank you to Ping.
Thank you, and hope I will see you probably in another session or in another webinar. Okay, thank you, everybody. Hope you can
We would
try
love that.
this new lesson. Thank you.
All right, bye everyone. Have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening.